All right, so now that we've discussed the basic strategy that we're going to be using for organizing our WebSockets, let's open up our server.js file. And we're also going to create a new file that will define a better structure for all of this logic that we've written so far. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new folder. And what this folder is going to be called, we'll call it something like connections. Actually, let's call it something like socket connections, just to make it a little bit more explanatory here. And what this is going to do, it's going to contain those objects that I showed you that will define the basic configuration for different situations that we're going to use WebSockets for. So let's create a new file here, and we're going to call this file index.js. And basically, this is going to do something very similar to what we did with our routes. Right? Remember, with our routes, we basically just defined all of our routes inside their own file with their own configuration object, and then we exported that as an array and imported that into our server and basically looped through that and translated the configuration object into actual Express code. So we're going to do that same thing for our socket connection types. So what we're going to do is say export const socket connections. And this is just going to be an array. It'll start off empty because we, of course, haven't defined any of these yet. So what we're going to do next is we're going to define a new file, which we'll call single note connection. Actually, let's call this something like note detail connection. That'll be a better name for this, I think. And once we've defined that, we're going to create that object that we talked about a little while ago, and that's going to look like this. We're going to say export const note detail connection. And remember the properties that I said this was going to have. It's going to have a name property. It's going to have a middleware property. And it's going to have an event handlers property. Oops, event handlers, there we go. And here's what those are going to look like for the time being. The name, of course, we can give this whatever name we want. It won't really be a big deal. It'll just be a way that will refer to different types of connections from the front end, as you'll see. So the name here, we're just going to call this one note detail. For the middleware, this is just going to be an empty array for now, since obviously we haven't defined any socket-compatible middleware yet. And for the event handlers, this will be an array that will add the individual handler configuration objects too. Okay, so let's go up here and add an extra comma. And while we're at it, let's just import this note detail connection thing into our socket connections and add it to our array. So we'll say import note detail connection from its file. And then we're going to add it to this array here, note detail connection. All right, so now that we have that, what we're going to do is define these event handlers. And what that's going to look like, we're actually going to create another folder for those. So we'll say new folder, and let's just call this one socket event handlers. Okay, now currently we only have one main handler, and that is for handling the update note event, right? If we scroll up to here, that's this place where we're saying socket.on, and then we have all of this other logic, okay? The rest of the stuff is really just checking permissions, so that'll be a job for the middleware later on. All right, so inside our socket connections folder here, let's create a new folder, which we'll call update note handler.js. And here's what this is going to look like for the time being. We're going to say export const update note handler, and it's going to be an object, as we said, with the property event name. All right, so this is going to be the name of the event that we want this to respond to. And for our purposes here, we're going to make that update note. That's the same one that we're referring to in our server.js file. And after that, we're going to say middleware. And for now, we'll just leave that empty. We'll get to that later on when we actually want to protect users who don't have access to the note from updating the note. And last but not least, we're going to have a handler property, which will be the asynchronous function that actually contains all of the logic that we want to execute when this event occurs on a given socket connection. So what this is going to look like, the handler remember, for Express apps looked like this. It was usually just an asynchronous function with request and response arguments. But since WebSockets don't have quite the same arguments, it's going to look a little bit different in our case. So what we're going to define this as, and this is actually something that we're defining here, it's not something that's inherent to Socket.io, as you'll see. For this callback, we're going to have two main arguments, and those are going to be data and socket. Okay, so essentially what this is going to represent, the socket here is going to be sort of like the request object in an Express server. It's going to contain information about the socket connection, right? Such as the parameters that are passed along when the socket connects, other things like maybe who the user is that connected through that socket, those sort of things. And the data here is just going to be any other kind of data that we need inside this handler in order to do our job. You'll see what kinds of things we need there very shortly, but it's going to include things like extra data passed along with whatever event we're handling here, as well as anything else that we need to pass in from the server, right, when we're adding all of our handlers. You'll see what this all looks like and how it works very shortly. So essentially what we're going to do inside our update note handler's handler function is we're going to take all of the logic that was inside socket.on and copy it and paste it. Okay? Now this is going to require us to import a few things. So let's go back to our server.js, and the easiest way I've found to do this is just to copy all of the imports and paste them all at the top of here and see which ones go gray, right? And you can just delete those. So we can see that the only things we're going to need are going to be the format shared note and the notes DB. All right. So we can see that most of the things are working here except for a few things which are underlined here, such as note ID, right? We need to know what the note ID is that the user is currently connected to when this handler is called. And we also need to know what the updated title and updated content are when this update note thing occurs, right? Remember that back here, we're getting those. If I scroll down, here we go. We're getting those directly passed to the callback. But since we're doing that in a little bit of a different way here, we're going to need to have those passed through this data thing. Again, you'll see how this fits together once we actually take this update note handler and translate it into Socket.io on our server.js file. All right, so for now, though, I'm just going to give you a hint. It's going to look like this. We're going to say const note ID, title and content equals data. And that's how we'll get all of that information that we need. Cool, so that's our update note handler. If we go back now to our note detail connection configuration object that we had here, what we're going to do now is we're going to import the update note handler. All right. And we're going to add that to the event handler's array of our note detail connections. So for that, we'll say update note handler. And that's about all we need to do there. That should give us enough to go off of to add this to our server.js file. So again, the way that this is working, let me just put this in order so we can walk through it here. This socket connections is an array that contains all of the different possible situations that we want to use WebSockets for. All right, so for now we only have one of those. It's on our note detail page when we want to keep users' notes in sync. If we drill down into each of these members of this array, we see that they look like this. They have a name, which is just a unique identifier that we can come up with. It's got middleware, which will define certain logic that's set up before we allow users to actually handle events. And it's got an event handlers property, which contains its own configuration objects for each event we want to handle and how we want to handle it. And those look like what we have here with event name, middleware, and handler, which contains all of the logic. So the way that this is all going to translate in our server.js file is going to look something like this. What I'm going to do is, instead of having this socket.on thing, right, we're going to be able to delete this almost completely. What we're going to do is we're going to import all of our socket connections. All right, so we'll just import those up at the top here. We'll say import socket connections from socket connections. And then what we're going to do back down here inside our io.connection thing is we're going to say socket connections dot for each. Again, this is kind of echoing what we did with our Express app here. And for each different type of socket connection, what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of the event handlers and add those to this socket. So what we're going to do is we're going to say connection.eventhandlers.forEach. Okay, so we have sort of a nested for each loop here for the time being. What we're going to do is we're going to say for each event handler, we're going to add that to our socket by saying socket.on. Then we're going to get the event handler.event name property, right? That's update note, for example. And we're going to define the callback here, which will look like this. It's going to, first of all, take all of the data that comes along with that event, and we're going to pass that through to the handler function of each event handler here, like this. We're going to say event handler dot handler. And we need to pass the data, which is going to be the first thing. And the second thing here is going to be a reference to the socket object, which will allow us to do things like get information about the socket, etc. Okay, and that actually reminds me of something I think I did wrong. Back here in our handler, in our update note handler, we're going to want to change this note ID thing, and we're going to need to get that off of the socket instead. So we'll say const note ID equals socket.handshake query, just like that, and that should give us the appropriate note ID there. And again, this kind of echoes how our handlers worked when we were defining express routes. So that's our update note handler, and that's how we add all of our handlers to each WebSocket. And this is a little bit simplified for the time being, simply because we only have one type of socket connection. So we will be adding a little bit more logic onto here later on, but hopefully you at least understand what's going on here. We're looping through each socket connection and adding all of the event handlers for each connection to our socket as it connects. So that's how that's going to work. If we run our application now, we should see, if we've done everything right, of course, that everything will work just like it did before. If it doesn't, we may have to go back and make some corrections. So let's see where it's at. All right, and it looks like we had some errors happen there. Let's take a look at this. So for util.format shared note, you know what happened is when we copied and pasted our update note handler imports, we forgot to add the double dot at the beginning. Right, it's going to be .util.db instead of just .util.db because it's in a different place of the file tree. So let's go back down here and see how that's looking so far. It looks like the server is listening, and you know what, just to be safe here, let's just try running this thing again, just to make sure we didn't miss any errors. Okay, so everything's looking good so far. Remember that we have just our regular window here and an incognito window, and these windows both have separate users logged in, and they can look at the same note because user 1 here has shared their notes with user 2. So let's go to the same note for both of these users. We're going to open up hello other Sean. And what we should see is what we saw before. We should be able to edit these things from either one of these users and immediately see the changes show up over here. Okay, and it looks like that's not working. So let's take a look at what the error was. So we see that IO is not defined in our update note handler. Basically, what we're going to have to do in order to make this work, there's two things we can do. The easy way for the time being is just to add IO as another argument to our handler and go back to our server and just pass IO through to this, and that will solve the problem for the time being. What we're actually going to do with IO eventually is similar to what we did with our database and move it out into its own file so that we can actually import that into individual files instead of having to pass it around like an argument. But for the time being, this is just the easiest thing to do, so there you go. All right, so let's try this again. We're going to click on Edit, and we're going to try and add some things here. And sure enough, it looks like everything is working just like it was before. And it goes both ways too, of course. So anyway, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.